Good evening, and welcome to our study tonight. Tonight, as we start in the news, let's start right off with prophecy. This article is pretty interesting. It says, why does the world seem to be in a constant state of crisis? For over 4 years now, almost everyone who pays attention to what's going on in the world lives in a constant state of anxiety. The reason? They're waiting for the next shoe to drop. There's so many things that have happened. The next major global event will actually open up their lives. Over the past 4 years, we've endured COVID, the government response to COVID, which were lockdowns and passports and mandates, global supply chain issues, global inflation, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and of course, October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, the shutdown of the Red Sea shipping lanes, and numerous rumors that other major events set to break at any moment. So what's next? Well, will it get worse before it gets better? The answer is, and I hate to say it, yes. So why? Well, let me give you a couple of reasons. First of all, the interregnum. Now, I know you don't know that word, so one of the reasons we see all these events taking place is the interregnum. So what does it mean? Well, the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language, 5th edition, defines an interregnum as this: the interval of time between the end of a sovereign's reign and the accession of a successor. You may have heard me say this a long time ago. It's called the Thucydides effect. He was a Greek historian in 430 BC. And he said whenever anybody's in power, a nation or a government or a king is in power, there's always that secondary one trying to come up and take over. So before World War II, the Royal Navy in the British Empire was in power. The sun never set on the British Empire. They had the greatest navy in the world. They were controlling the world's shipping lanes, issuing the world's global reserve currency, the pound, and boasting the world's premier center of international finance, which was in London. So when 1945 ended, the United States Navy ruled the high seas. U.S. military bases spanned the globe, and the United States dominated the 20th century global order, controlling the world's shipping lanes, issuing the world's global reserve currency, the dollar, and boasting of the world's premier center of international finance, which was New York. But as 2024 begins, we see U.S. naval power is waning. Houthi rebels have shut down the Red Sea to all traffic from Israel at one time. Almost 12% of all global trade passes through the Suez Canal, making the Red Sea one of the most vital shipping corridors in the world. For over 80 years, the United States Navy has carried on the role of ensuring the world's shipping lanes remain largely negotiable and open to international trade. Now, they are increasingly unable to do so. The ability of the U.S. to project military power across the globe and secure vital waterways is one of the primary reasons the U.S. dollar dominates international trade. Another reason is the petrodollar. When President Nixon ended the U.S. dollar's convertibility to gold, it became a fiat currency, meaning its value is derived from nothing more than the government edict. Since that day in 1971, all the world's major currencies have been fiat currencies, something unprecedented in history. History shows all fiat currencies eventually reach their intrinsic value, which is zero. So what happens when all the world's currencies collapse at the same time? Well, in 1974, Henry Kissinger brokered a deal with Saudi Arabia where OPEC agreed to only trade oil for dollars. This has helped underpin demand for U.S. dollars for the past 50 years. But now, the petrodollar is ending. Saudi Arabia and OPEC are increasingly accepting other currencies for oil instead of the dollar. U.S. debt is at unsustainable levels. Just today, billions again were given out to Ukraine. Foreign nations are dumping U.S. debt in favor of gold, and the BRICS nations are attempting to create an alternative to the U.S.-dominated global financial system. In other words, the post-World War II order of global military power is right now transforming, and the current global monetary system is coming to an end. So what's really happening? Well, if the interregnum alone is not the reason for this constant state of crisis, then what's really happening? Well, why do we see all these global events taking place? The answer is pretty simple. Jesus is coming back. The constant state of crisis we see today is exactly what Jesus said the world would look like just before his return. In Matthew 24, the disciples asked him, what will be the sign of the end of the world? And Jesus said, nation will rise against nation. He said that wars and rumors of wars will come. He said there'll be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world. But then he says, all this is only the first of birth pains, with more to come. You need to hear that last thing I just said. Jesus said, all this is only the first of birth pains, with more to come. What does Jesus mean by the phrase birth pains? Well, birth pains are sharp pains that increase in both frequency and intensity in the moments leading up to birth. Jesus said this is the exact same pattern that will precede his coming. So I'd like to tell you that things are going to get better, but if Jesus is right, if he's accurate, then things will not get better. That's wishful thinking, but it's not prophecy. There's another name for this pattern. It's called the exponential curve. An exponential curve that increases right up until the time a baby is born. According to Jesus, the signs he describes in the general nature of things in this world will increase again in both frequency and intensity just prior to his arrival. In other words, the exponential increase of the signs of his coming is how we know he's near. So as we see these things increasing, that's how we know Christ is near. I'm really shocked that churches in America and around the world don't preach more of it. Some of them actually go against it. Some of them ignore it altogether. This is something that I said this last week. I feel like I'm building an ark by telling people to get ready because it's coming. And we're talking about Noah in our Genesis study. That's exactly what he did. But most people put their heads in the sand. Most people say, I don't care, it doesn't matter, it's not affecting me right now. Well, I don't want to scare anyone, but if Jesus said this is what's supposed to happen, and it's happening, then we got to get ready. So what are the signs? Well, fortunately, we don't have to guess. Jesus told us, the prophets told us, and the Bible is filled with verses that tell us. Furthermore, Jesus told us how to recognize the general time frame of his return. And I've given these signs over and over again. I've preached them, I've taught them, but let me just go very briefly about them. A few of the signs are these. Israel is back in its own land. Ezekiel 39:28, Jeremiah 23:7 and 8, Psalm 107:3, Isaiah 11:11 and 12. It is a sign. It didn't happen till 1948. We're the generation that has seen the sign. The Jewish people are in control of Jerusalem. That's mentioned in Luke 21:24-28. That only happened since 1967. The gospel preached throughout the world, Matthew 24:14. Christians have taught the gospel and brought the gospel to every nation in the world. Today, missionaries are in every nation. The Bible is translated in hundreds of languages. And the message of Jesus sent around the world is by radio, TV, satellite, and the internet. For the first time in history, we're on the verge of seeing the gospel preached to every last person on earth. Digital currencies. According to the Atlantic Council, 135 countries representing 98 of the global GDP are exploring, developing, or preparing to roll out central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. You've heard me talking about them, giving government insight into every financial transaction that takes place of everyone in the world. Almost 2,000 years ago, the Bible said it would happen. He required everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to be given a mark on the right hand or on the forehead, and no one could buy or sell anything without that mark. While CBDCs are not the mark of the beast, they are definitely setting the stage for it. Israel surrounded by enemies, Psalm 83:4, Psalm 83:12, Ezekiel 11:14-17, Ezekiel 35:10. Israel right now has been surrounded by her enemies. Rise of the Gog and Magog alliance. The Bible says a military alliance will include Russia, Iran, and Turkey, and members of the Muslim nations that will attack Israel in the latter days, Ezekiel 39. Russia, Iran, and Turkey have recently, just in the last 2 years, made a military pact together. The rise of a united Europe, a revived Roman Empire. Daniel says a 10-nation empire will have the alliance will be of weak and strong nations. All you need to do is look at the European Union. It has weak and strong nations. Daniel 2:42. The rise of a global government. A single government will rule the world politically, Revelation 13:7, religiously, Revelation 13:8, and economically, Revelation 13:16-17. For centuries, a true global government was absolutely impossible. Today, world leaders openly discuss it. Denial of the signs is another sign. Almost 2,000 years ago, Peter issued a warning. He said, in the last days, people will mock the idea of Jesus returning. They will make fun of those who believe in the second coming and say exactly what we hear today. Things like, I thought Jesus was coming back, or what happened to his promise, or generation after generation has said he's coming. Yet since the beginning of the world, everything has remained the same. 2 Peter 3 and 4. The world is in crisis because Jesus is coming back. Keep in mind, these signs haven't always been present. Generation of Christians lived and died without witnessing any of these signs. For centuries of Christian history, none of these signs were present. Today, they are all present. Jesus said, when you see these signs, you can know his return is near. He's right at the door. Matthew 24:33. In fact, Jesus said the generation that witnesses these signs will not pass away before his return. We are that generation. So get ready to answer the door. Let's go a little bit further in the news. Let me give you this from New World Order. And obviously you've seen this or heard on news. Columbia University faces full-blown crisis as rabbi calls for Jewish students to return home. It's happening all over the United States. Columbia University is facing a full-blown crisis heading into Passover as a rabbi linked to the Ivy League school urged Jewish students to stay home, and tense confrontations on campus sparked condemnation from the White House and New York officials. Very little condemnation. Also it's happening in NYU, and it's happening in California. Texas, thankfully, this week has shut down any type of colleges that want to do protesting. Tensions at Columbia, though, and many universities have been high ever since October 7th terror attack on Israel by Hamas. The latest crisis has opened Columbia President Mishu Shafiq up to new attacks from her critics. Columbia's continued failure to restore order and safety prompted the campus constitutes a major breach of the university's Title VI obligations, upon which federal financial assistance is contingent and which must immediately be rectified. I believe that the government needs to stop giving money to these campuses if they're not going to do anything about the protesters who burn American flags and Israeli flags and yell death to America. We know they're staged. We know there's not just students there. There's people being bussed in, just like in the BLM riots. And you could tell that by the same color of the tents that are set up. All the same colors. They're coming from someplace. We need to stop funding these seedbeds of Marxism, and the government needs to do it. It's very well planned. It's anti-Israeli and anti-America. On campuses, I see flags like this, and it's kind of amazing to me. Queers for Palestine. You know what that's like? That's like saying hens for Chick-fil-A. Palestinians and radical Muslims will kill queers. They put them in prison. These people don't even know what they're protesting for. There was one girl who was in a protest saying, "From the river to the sea." She had a sign. An anchor interviewed her and said, "What river? What sea?" She mumbled. She couldn't understand. She didn't understand the question. She said, "I don't know what river." They don't even know what they're protesting about. This is something that's a fly in the face for American freedom, and it needs to stop. It really does. Let's go a little bit further. Talk about NPR, National Public Radio. That's what it's supposed to stand for. Well, no bias here. NPR has 0 Republicans, 87 Democrats on its editorial staff. In a widely publicized op-ed published this Tuesday in the Free Press, a senior editor at National Public Radio, NPR, offered a heavy criticism of its employer as he revealed that, despite the news organization's claim that it's diverse, in its D.C. headquarters, it has 0 Republicans and 87 Democrats among its editorial staff. Yuri Berliner, a senior business editor and reporter at NPR, described how over the last 15 years, the organization has drifted relentlessly leftward and has become the distilled worldview of a very small segment of the U.S. population. He illustrated this change by highlighting NPR's shifting audience. In 2011, 26% of listeners said they were conservative. By 2023, only 10% said they were conservative. Liberals almost doubled to 67%. Berliner went on to describe how during most of his 25 years at NPR, there was an understood liberal bend. But he said also now, he writes, an open-minded spirit no longer exists within NPR, and now predictably, we don't have an audience that reflects an open opinion. The NPR senior editor pointed out further examples, including the organization's international decision to ignore the Hunter Biden laptop story, the dismissal of strong evidence supporting a lab leak at the COVID-19 virus in Wuhan, China, and an apparent obsession with race. However, when Berliner recounted pointing out this to his colleagues during an all-staff editorial meeting, that he found 87 registered Democrats working in editorial positions and 0 Republicans at NPR's DC newsroom, it was met with profound indifference. An organization claiming to be an independent nonprofit media organization that was founded on a mission to create a more informed public that relies on public funding for roughly 32% of its budget to reflect a wide variety of viewpoints held by tax-paying Americans. It doesn't. It's a left-leaning propaganda organization. Let's go a little bit further and give you a little bit about Israel. And this one's very interesting. I think it's very good for us to say this tonight and to listen to it. Will the nations impose a peace agreement upon Israel That seems the furthest from the truth to think peace when we see all these wars flying around. But listen to this, it makes great biblical and logical sense. This last week, when Iran launched a barrage of 350 drones and missiles against the Jewish state, maybe the most surprising aspect was that Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE, supported Israel. Just let that sink in for a moment. All these nations are opposed to what Israel is doing in Gaza. They're not friendly with Israel in any respect. However, these three nations supported Israel against an aggressive attack from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Even Jordan took part in the shooting down of Iranian missiles. Years ago, they would have been glad to have any missiles flying over their airspace, knowing the target was Israel. Other Arab nations, like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, provided valuable intelligence to Israel about the timing of the attack. According to reports, Iran tipped off Saudi Arabia as to what it was going to do and when it would do it. Saudi Arabia then, in turn, secretly passed that information along to Israel to give them a heads up for the timing of this attack. Something that would have been unthinkable even just a few years ago. Ezekiel 38 tells us that a massive invasion is coming upon Israel. According to Ezekiel, before the invasion occurs, now listen well, there must be a peace and rest in Israel. This is an essential precondition for the Gog-Magog war. Ezekiel 38, 8 and 9 and verse 11 tells us what has to be in place for the Gog-Magog invasion to occur. Quote, after many days, you will be called to arms, referring to the Gog coalition. In future years, you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They have been brought out from the nations, and now all of them live in safety. Listen to it. All of them live in safety. Not only does Israel need to be regathered and brought from the nations, which occurred in 1948, but they will also have to be living in safety. Verse 9 continues, you and all your troops and many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land. Verse 11 then says, you will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls, without gates, and without bars. Well, that doesn't describe Israel today. Israel, sometime in the future, will have some sense of security, and they'll let down their guard. I believe it's going to happen because a covenant or a treaty that the Antichrist will make to bring peace to that part of the world. That will likely have to be in place before the Gog-Magog invasion. What we're witnessing today is more and more willing peace partners for Israel among the Arab nations. This is something that we've not seen since 1948, and it's a necessary precondition for the beginning of the tribulation, where the Antichrist will forge a peace agreement with Israel. Daniel 9:27 says, the meaning, he, meaning the Prince Antichrist that is coming, will confirm, you can also translate that word as compel, a covenant with many for 7 years. In the midst of the 7 years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. The event that starts the 7-year tribulation is this peace treaty that the Antichrist makes and forges with Israel and its neighbors. We need to understand what's going on right now. I have an opportunity to call the man. I've been in contact with someone who knows him, the man that brought the red heifers to Israel. He's a farmer from Texas. I have his number, and I'm going to be calling him any day now. And basically, we're seeing everything line up. This peace treaty has to come, and it'll be an imposed peace. This week, Time Magazine published an article titled "$1 Million Middle East Peace Plan." It lays out a scenario for peace between Israel and its Middle East enemies that is chillingly similar to what the Bible predicts. The author, Kay Bird, says, this conflict is so dangerous that the time has come for the international community to impose a solution, a compelled solution to the nations. That is precisely what Daniel 9:27 says. He will confirm or compel a covenant with many for 7 years. The idea of confirming literally in Hebrew means to make strong. He's going to make strong covenant or even compel a covenant. The Time Magazine article insists that the international community needs to impose a solution. According to the author, they must convene a Geneva Peace Conference where all the essential parties will be forced to participate and face financial and legal sanctions if they fail to show up. You know, America, United States will be the first one to want to have that peace treaty with Biden. But American, European, and other international diplomats invited to Geneva will be responsible for the actual drafting of a peace treaty, the Time magazine article said. So nations other than Israel and their enemies will develop the peace treaty draft. It will be brokered by an outside forces, which is exactly what Daniel 9:27 predicts. It's a flashing red light. The current crisis between Israel and Hamas, as well as Israel and Iran, is setting the stage for the Gog-Magog war. But it's also setting the stage for the event that is to precede that war, which is the coming Middle East peace treaty. All the ingredients for this Middle East peace treaty are coalescing. We see a coalition of willing partners now for Israel. We see people calling for peace to be imposed by outside forces. All the key threads are being woven together right before our eyes. A possible escalating cycle of attacks will only serve to further prepare for the Antichrist's arrival and the coming time of tribulation. What is happening right now is a flashing red light that the coming of Jesus Christ could be very soon. Do you see the theme that I'm talking about tonight in the news about Christ coming? And let me tell you something, I'll give you my own opinion here. I think the peace treaty will be something like this. Israel is nuclear. We've been thinking and we've been hearing about them using a limited nuclear strike. Iran is almost nuclear. They're not there. What if they're allowed to build the third temple in this peace treaty if they lay down their nukes? Let me tell you something. Bible prophecy is right at our door. Let's go a little bit further and just talk about something more closer to home. The economy. Food is now an investment, this article says. Here's why inflation isn't going away anytime soon. Economics is very similar to politics. The propaganda is endless, and debunking it sometimes feel like moving a mountain with a teaspoon. As for inflation, here's the bottom line. Central banks and the fiat flood. Rising prices are caused by two main drivers. The first is money creation, which we are doing hand over fist. We are printing more and more money. It's fueling inflation. It's too many dollars chasing too few goods. Central banks around the world have been flooding the system with fiat currency ever since the debt crisis of 2008. And the Federal Reserve within the United States is the worst violator by far. We keep spending money we do not have. I told you in an article before this, all fiat currencies are going to reach their limit, which is zero. They'll be worth absolutely nothing. Germany could tell you that from World War I and World War II. We are talking about tens of trillions or more in money creation, all supposedly as a means to stall or prevent a deflationary crash. So if you want to know who is directly to blame for your daily expenses, the first set of criminals are the central bankers. Governments and certain corporate partners are also to blame. Central banks have deliberately triggered a stagflation crisis with the intent to forcefully replace cash-based economies with a new digital and cashless global economy. I don't know how long I have to say it before it actually happens, but it's going to happen. And listen, I know a lot of you are listening to me alone. A lot of you have heard me say this over. I said this 2 years ago about CBDCs, and now we're seeing it on steroids. It's going to happen. It won't surprise me if the United States government starts to pull in all the $100 bills. It won't surprise me if they start giving $200 for every $100 you bring in CBDCs. It's going to happen. Then there's shortages and core resources. The other primary cause of rising prices is shortages or disruptions in key resources, including oil and energy. The war in Ukraine has led to the West being cut off from large portions of reserve-rich Russian market. And the war in Gaza has led to troops in the Middle East like the Houthis denying a multitude of cargo ships and oil tankers from traversing the Red Sea. The effects become detrimental. The biggest factor is rising energy prices because this is the key resource that allows all agriculture and manufacturing to function. Every time oil prices rise, you're going to see prices in everything else rise. It's exactly the reason why the Biden administration continued to dump the U.S. strategic oil reserves in the market for the past couple of years. Now that they're being pressured to refill those reserves and start buying at a much higher price, by the way, global oil prices and U.S. prices in particular are spiking again. Watch. All you have to do, you don't have to be an economist, watch food prices and watch gasoline prices. That's all you have to do. As you see them rising up, you'll understand the crunch. Media disinformation and crushing food costs. Food costs have risen 30% or more since the beginning of Biden's administration. 30% or more. They tell us that inflation's coming down. That's ridiculous. Inflation is going up, not as high as it went up the year before, but it's still going up. It's still 30% over what it was 3 years ago. They keep rising with each passing year. When the media toots that the economy is improving, what they usually don't mention is that the stat only represents how much higher prices are going to go. Meanwhile, and meaning that 30% plus increase in food that Americans have been dealing with, that's not going to go away. It's just not climbing as fast as it was. And the White House says their main explanation is greedflation, where they claim that companies are overcharging on food items. Biden had the audacity to take out a bag of chips and say that there's less chips. It's ridiculous. In other words, blame business. Don't blame the Federal Reserve, and don't blame the government. Don't blame the banks. They're all innocent of this. So far, there's no concrete evidence to support the greedflation theory. It's obvious that commodities are climbing. The industrial commodity index is far higher today than it was in 2020, along with oil and gas prices. Every base resource that companies use to make products is increasing in value. Every base resource. And thus it costs them more to manufacture. Agriculture in particular is heavily affected by oil prices, as well as prices in fertilizer and farming equipment, not to mention higher costs in labor. And here's where I'm going to give you some instruction. There is no indication that agricultural costs are going to stop increasing in the near future. So that means each year, food is going to cost you more and more than the year before. It might even cost you much more than the year before. So what's the conclusion? This is why people need to start looking at food as an investment, similar to the way they might look at their 401k or a retirement plan. If you want to mitigate costs in the future in terms of food, you will need to purchase foods with long shelf lives right now. If you think that inflation is passing phase and things are going to go back to the way they were before 2020, then you probably won't take this concern seriously. But consider this. The food storage that I bought in 2020 now costs at least 30 to 50% more to buy in 2024. Meanwhile, some of the top mainstream economists in the country were denying such things would ever happen. When it did happen, they claimed it was transitory. This was also proven false. Now they claim food will drop after companies are forced through regulation to cut prices. It is quickly becoming necessary to invest in food security as soon as possible. Government-enforced price controls have never actually been proven effective in stopping inflation. Once you remove all profit incentives, many businesses will just close up shop. This causes the supply of goods to go down, and prices then will spike anyway due to the shortages. So do you want to bet your future on established economists being right for once? Because there never are. Or do you want to just store some food today in knowledge that prices are only going to go exponentially higher? It won't hurt you. And I'm not trying to tell you to be a survivalist. Just tell you that you can save some money by getting some shelf life food that lasts a little longer than a year. Let's go a little bit further and tell you a little bit about religion. This is some good news. Half of U.S. Latinos are identifying as evangelical, will identify as evangelical by 2030. Some of the most important developments in the kingdom of God occur out of the public eye. You're not going to hear it in the news. By 2030, half of U.S. Latinos will identify as Protestant evangelicals. This is great news for the kingdom of God. The label Latino applies to more than 60 million individuals that live in the United States. Really a composite way of reporting that thousands, perhaps even millions, of individual people made in God's image are receiving salvation in Christ. More and more Latinos are becoming evangelical every single day. As Latinos become more and more Protestant, more and more evangelical, they vote their conservative Christian worldview. It's why the Democrats are so scared right now. Primarily, Latino evangelicals are growing increasingly distant from the political policy priorities of the anti-Christian secular left. They don't believe that government is God. Hence, socialism and communism are antithetical to their faith. They believe in parental rights. They're pro-life, pro-religious liberty, committed to biblical justice. Democrats seem to have convinced themselves at least that they can take the Latino vote for granted. They cannot. Now they're finding out that Latinos are much more grounded in biblical truth and values than was expected. This rightward shift has surprised pundits because it defies the logic of Marxist identity politics. Latinos repudiate the progressive part of our electorate, the hard left, the liberals, labeling Latinos as perpetual victims. The Democratic Party is committing political suicide by alienating Latinos every single day, and I'm thankful they are. Not alienating, but committing political suicide. And more by advancing agendas that are antithetical to who they are and what they believe. Talk about faith, family, limited government, parental rights, you will win more Latino voters. One more religion, this one's one I don't want to tell you, I'm not going to show you the pictures, but this happened 2 weeks ago, and it's really a big stink in the Christian world. Mark Driscoll calls out a megachurch over controversial sword-swallowing performance at a men's event. This man says, I've been up since 1 o'clock in the morning, Driscoll said, the senior and founding pastor of Trinity Church in Scottsdale, Arizona. Attendees at the Stronger Men's Conference, which was held April 12th and 13th at the Great Southern Bank Arena in Springfield, Missouri. The Jezebel spirit opened our event, he said on stage. Before the word of God was opened, there was a platform, he continued. It was a high place. On it was a pole, an asherah, the same thing that is used in a strip club for women who have the Jezebel spirit to seduce men. In front of that was a man who ripped his shirt off like a woman does in front of a pole at a strip club. This is at a men's conference. You talk about Christianity going downhill in America. I'm really not crazy about what's happening in a lot of churches. Way, way too worldly, way too user-friendly. At that moment, John Lindell, the lead pastor of the James River Church, 2 huge churches in Missouri who organized the Strong Men's Conference, can be heard calling Driscoll's name and saying he was out of line as he was on the stage. Okay, Pastor John, he says, I'll receive that. Driscoll said before going off stage, thank you. Now, just listen. This was not the first time that the conference featured an unusual event. During last year's conference, a tank can be seen rolled out and crushing several cars while pyrotechnics went off. Additionally, the song Danger Zone by Kenny Loggins, secular song, was played by a band on stage. My question is, what's happened to the church? I've been a pastor for a long time. I have never seen anything like this. The church is anemic. It's weak. I'll tell you what happened. The world happened to the church. Sometimes I can't tell the difference anymore. Now I'm thankful. If you go to a strong Bible-believing church, I'm thankful for that. But I'll tell you what, it's getting more and more secular. And it makes me want to have nothing to do with that type of church. Let me go a little bit further and give you another one. Man, Biden's Department of Education goes after Christian universities. Man, the enemy is going against Christians every way, secularizing them and then going after them with the government. A dust storm of political madness is brewing in Phoenix, Arizona. Excuse me. As Grand Canyon University, the largest Christian university in the United States, faces the continued threats of the Department of Education Secretary Miguel Cardona. Christians have watched as the Biden administration attacked biblical views left and right with a particular vehement disregard of the sanctity of life and of marriage. Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona, part of Biden's leftist administration, has vowed to shut down America's largest Christian university. In late October, GCU was hit with a $37.7 million fine over allegations that it lied to students about the cost of its programs, an accusation which GCU President Brian Mueller says was absolutely ridiculous. Around the same time, Liberty University, America's second largest Christian university, was also fined $37 million over alleged unreporting of crimes. This genuine consideration for the well-being of students, is it? Or is this a targeted attack against religious institutions? They're not saying anything about Columbia, but they're fining religious colleges, the 2 biggest ones. It's interesting, isn't it? That the 2 largest Christian universities in the country are both being fined almost the exact identical amount at almost the exact identical time. This April, the House Appropriations Committee held a hearing specifically about the administration's decision to, quote, crack down on GCU and other universities like it, Christian universities. During the proceedings, Cardona and Representative Rosa DeLauro, a Democrat from Connecticut, made their disapproval for GCU and similar universities obvious. Quote, we are cracking down not only to shut them down, but to send a message to not prey on students, Cardona emphasized. The fine seems unprecedented and motivated by ideological bias, including American Principles Project Policy Director John Swepp, who said the federal government's education agenda is punishing schools that do not conform to the progressive ideology. With its motto of private Christian affordable and its track record of graduating students into high demand and high paying jobs, GCU is a success story by any metric. As it stands apart from universities across the country that are facing declining enrollment, that are indoctrinating students with radical politics, and that are under attack for failing to defend the First Amendment, the enrollments are just continuing to grow at this Christian university. And morale is very high in terms of the faculty and staff. The campus is extremely vibrant. The students absolutely love that place. They're extremely loyal to it, and they just keep marching through it. GCU is trying to be an example of a Christian community that can rise above those things and focus on helping people through service. Wow. Jew hatred on secular campuses, Christian bashing and hatred and fines by the Biden administration. The devil is in pursuit. And this is under good news tonight. You know you need some, so here it is. Man, it's about time. I knew it was coming. Parents fight back against mandatory queer indoctrination at a school. If you want to get excited about something, this is something to get excited about. Schools across America many times are run by managers who come with baggage from extreme left ideologies of higher academia. Their plans often include spreading those ideas to students, whether or not they or their parents want such indoctrination. But one such plan in a school in Minnesota has been taken down a notch, according to a new report from Matt Staver, chief of Liberty Counsel. The dispute developed in Osseo, Minnesota, where officials scheduled a gay pride indoctrination class for all students, prepared scripts from which the teacher would read word for word, used a scenario that required teachers to take part regardless of their religious beliefs and rights or be fired. The push for the far-left agenda came from 4 radical school board members, Liberty Counsel reported. Teachers were not allowed to opt out of teaching LGBTQIA plus history and culture lesson. And the district deliberately made it difficult for parents to review the lesson materials in advance or opt their children out of the politically charged nonsensical course. Parents, in fact, had to apply for permission to see the materials, had to appear in person at the school, and had to document their identity, the report said. The actual curriculum conflicted with science and used pop culture to push students to adopt fake pronouns and more. The lessons then encourage students to question their own sexuality, asking the children if they are confused about or curious about and questioning their sexuality, fitting within at least one of the Q categories in its lengthy acronym. Students were to be told failure to embrace the ideology risked having their assignments labeled incorrect and failing. But then Liberty Counsel notified the school district of its need to allow students, parents, and teachers to exercise their right to opt out of such ideologies. The district caved, and more than 1,000 students opted out of the classes in just one school. At another school, 400 opted out. In fact, so many parents opted their children out of the lesson that the schools had to open their cafeterias and their auditoriums to accommodate the teachers and students who refused the indoctrination. In addition, another 500 students did not attend school at all the day of the instruction. I love that story. That's what has to happen in America, and in fact, it is.